I'm not going to be one of those people that say what I'm here to say and run, except I have to do that. Beth is a reader at 4 o'clock Mass. We'll be back, and then if there are people still here that would like to talk, I'd be happy to do that, and we'll be here for the 6 o'clock session. I spent 25 years in the oil and gas business and 4 years in electric power generation. The questions you're asking are, they're the questions I used to ask even when I was on the inside of the industry. How do we make any money? There were times I honestly didn't understand how we did, because I know what it costs to drill, and I understand the capital that you have to put out up front. If you're building a loop to an existing pipeline, it may be $400 million. Not everybody has $400 million to spend to make that project happen. And one of the things we were very concerned about in the energy industry, New York's DEC, and it was kind of interesting because having been commissioner, then I came back and actually had some issues before the DEC. So I got to see from both sides. The DEC is very rigorous in the way they go about their job. And when you hear from a next speaker, I think you'll see that sometimes that can be beneficial. I know Senator Seward, when he spoke here, he commented about how he was confident that the DEC could do the job with regard to regulating gas. And then he went on and introduced home rule legislation, which took the ability right out of DEC's hands. I don't fully understand that, and the senator's a good friend of mine, and we've talked about that. I think when you look at the power side, we had 2 coal-fired power plants in New York, and DEC wanted us to install bag houses on those, and it was going to cost $360 million. The CEO said, I can't do that, the shareholders will revolt. And the alternative was to install gas-fired turbines. Very inexpensive relatively, and you can put them up in a hurry. The problem is you're burning a premium fuel, natural gas, to transmit electricity at about a 40% efficiency. You include line drop and so forth. That didn't make good sense to us, because you only get to burn that gas once. And do you want to burn it to transmit electricity or generate electricity, or do you want it to be available for people to cook and heat their homes? Those are discussions that are going on all the time, and the one thing I hope you get out of this exercise this weekend, first of all, the world isn't black or white. About 98% of it is gray. And in order to make good decisions about how to operate within the gray, you need good information. The information that has been circulated about gas drilling, I mean, I go home at night and lose whatever hair I have left. It's just crazy what's out there in terms of misinformation and deliberate disinformation. I'm not here today, and the other speakers aren't here today, to tell you what to do. You're adults. We need to be treated like adults, and we're not being in this debate. And what I mean is, if we give you good information today, then you'll be more apt to make good decisions. If you decide that this isn't something you want, and you make that decision based on good information, more power to you. But if you say this isn't something I want, or this is something I want, based on bad information, you're going to get bad results. That's just the way it works. And the real discussion, and I've said this from the beginning, shouldn't be I'm for this or I'm against this. That's not productive. The only people that win in that discussion are attorneys. And you've seen that there's one parading around, saying the sky is falling and telling communities that he's working pro bono. You know what that means, to be working pro bono? It means you're working for free. Attorneys who work for free are generally part of a big firm, and all the lawyers together make a commitment to the community, and they take one of the attorneys, or maybe two, and say, okay, you can work for a town or a not-for-profit so many hours this year, and the rest of us will eat that expense. That's not the same as being an attorney who's paid by a foundation that is opposed to something and then coming around and saying, I'm working pro bono. You're not working pro bono when you're being paid by somebody who's opposed to what it is that the towns are debating. Do you understand the difference there? What's the old expression? He who pays the fiddler gets to call the tune. Who's really paying the fiddler? It's the foundation that's putting up the money so that that fiddler can say he's working pro bono. I don't like that. I don't like somebody telling me something that really isn't quite the way it is, and somebody who's telling me how I should think. DEC's mission is two-parted. A lot of people don't realize that. If you read the statute, it says that DEC's job is to protect the quality of the environment and to do it in a way that ensures economic vitality in New York's economy. Very interesting. Whoever crafted the initial legislation in 1970 didn't say that those two are mutually exclusive. They said that they're inextricably intertwined. So we need to look at things when we say how, and that should be the focus. How can we develop natural gas in this area in a way that both protects the quality of the environment and provides for economic stimulation? And that's right within DEC's mission. I think all of you know that DEC is not known for being too lax or too easy. So whatever their charge, I think they'll go about it with vigor. The other thing is, we often say that we're worried about pollution. Is there a company out there that deliberately pollutes today? If you pollute groundwater, you're looking at a multi-million-dollar cleanup cost over several years. Nobody wants to do that. When I was responsible for environmental health and safety, that was my worst nightmare. And we didn't do it. The companies I worked for won the National Wildlife Federation's top award. They won Ducks Unlimited's top award, Conservation Fund. You know, international conservation groups were recognizing that the companies were behaving themselves and doing good things for fish and wildlife. The other thing is, if a company has to pay for pollution, what's it doing to you? How many of you have a 401k? Anybody in this room have a 401k? Many of the people that are opposed to drilling here have a 401k. They're retired, either from the state, or from teaching, or from industry. What does their retirement portfolio consist of? Mutual funds that are heavily weighted to energy stocks. I've often wondered why somebody would be opposed to something that generates the earnings that they're using to retire. And if a company behaves irresponsibly and pollutes, what happens to their share value? It goes down. What happens to earnings? They go down. Would you be happy if that happened? No. I think Beth is going to have to be in that jacket.
You're not in the jacket.
They're in my pocket.
Sorry for the interruption.
Being too long-winded and she's got to leave. So I'll run through this. There's 8 steps in gas development that if you have gas activity on your property, it starts out with geology or seismic work. What's neat about Marcellus in terms of risk. We pretty much know where the gas is. It's not like we've got to spend a lot of money drilling and having dry holes. We know it's in that shale, and we know where the shale is. Why haven't we produced it before? Because the rock is very tight. It has small pores. What's the difference if I put two marbles this big next to each other versus two marbles that big next to each other? Which one has more space between the marbles? The bigger marbles have more interstitial space. Well, with shale, you don't have much of that space. And we say the rock is tight. That's why you have to frack it. You have to create an area for the gas to move and to gather. We know where it is. It's just how do you get the gas out? And it's relatively recent that you've had the combination of fracking and horizontal drilling. Very quickly, horizontal drilling is different than vertical. If this room, from floor to ceiling, is Marcellus shale, if I drill from up there, which is the surface, down with a vertical hole, I might have a bore of, say, 12 inches that's affecting the shale from the floor, or from the ceiling to the floor. I can draw so much gas out of that. If it was traditional, I might have to put in 36 wells to deplete the gas out of 2 square miles. With horizontal drilling, I'd come down from the ceiling, halfway maybe, and then go that way, and that way, and that way, and that way. Which way keeps me in the Marcellus shale for a longer time? The horizontal. I'm in the formation. Now if I can frack it, create little openings along the way, I can gather the gas with a lot fewer surface wells and a lot more efficiently. And that's what hydrofracking, or now we're talking about propane fracking, is all about. It's getting the gas out of that rock. So we do the geology, the seismic, we lease. Companies come to you and say, I'd like to lease your property. That's a wonderful time for you to say, I want to work with you while you're on my property. You're going to have all this heavy equipment. I've got a couple farm roads that are really in terrible shape. Can you help me out? I'd like to have a farm pond. Can you help me out? You'll find a willingness to work with you when the companies are working on your property. This isn't a good guy, bad guy thing. This needs to be a partnership. Site selection and preparation. Where on the property are we going to put the well pads? Drilling. That's really the quickie part. 21 days maybe per well. Bing, they're down in the formation. We're getting ready to complete the well. Then start production. Then transportation. Transportation, as we've already heard, is going to be done inside a pipeline. If the pipeline goes across states, like if it was in the southern tier and it went into Pennsylvania, it's an interstate pipeline. Then it's regulated by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. If it's only inside one state, it's intrastate, it's regulated by the Public Service Commission, New York's Public Service Commission. And then if you go from a big pipe to a smaller pipe, eventually you go to a local distribution company like NYSEG, and they distribute the gas out to your residents. So it can go from that well into a pipeline to somebody who's actually going to take it to your house and sell it to you. That's how it works. And it has to be put under pressure. If it's a big pipe, a 36-inch pipe, it's running at about 800 psi, 800 pounds per square inch. To do that, you have to have compressor stations, big engines with big pistons that compress the gas. And then reclamation, they come in, reclaim the site where the well pads were, and by the end of the year, the only thing you're going to see is a little wellhead Christmas tree sticking up. That's where, again, there's a wonderful opportunity to do things for wildlife. I'm president and CEO of the Rough Grouse Society right now, which is a wildlife conservation group, and we work with the energy companies during this process because there are opportunities not to destroy wildlife habitat, but to create it. We need young forests, brush. People think we're running out of trees. New York's got 10 million more acres of trees today than we had in the 1960s. We're not running out of trees. So, a little bit, that's the environmental side, the economic side. Since the fourth quarter of 2009, Pennsylvania has had 48,000 new jobs. 71% of those were filled with local people, an average salary of $70,000 plus. The taxes collected for the first 3 months of 2011 exceeded all of 2010 collections by $20 million. In other words, as the industry ramped up, the tax base increased and the communities benefited. There's some, I think, news that you need to be aware of because New York is increasingly being recognized as anti-business. Talisman is going to be leaving New York. Chesapeake's midstream group that's down in Horseheads is going to be leaving New York this summer. They're saying New York doesn't want us. And they've got millions of dollars tied up in leases, and in order to pay that back, they need to be able to drill. They've got to create something they can sell. And so they're saying, we can't do it here. We're going to go someplace else where we can do the same thing and recoup what we lost in New York and hopefully make some money. That's what's happening right now as we talk. People are making those decisions, and the folks that don't want this to happen are going to say, we won. Well, let's look at the we won. Solar is about 10 times as expensive as gas right now. So if your school district electric bill, say, is $20,000 a month, if you went to solar, it would be $200,000 a month. If you went to wind, which is 6 times more expensive, it'd be $120,000 a month. I don't know about you, but I don't know if we can afford that. And those are the things that are, at risk right now or at play. The fact that gas prices are where they are is a good thing for us, and I think you're going to see more investment in the use of natural gas for trucks, for example. That's kind of a no-brainer. Water use, this is one I hear all the time. If we talk about water use per million BTUs, for Marcellus fracked gas, you use about 1 gallon per million BTUs. How many of you burn gasoline with ethanol in it? Yeah, we all do, right? And we're all concerned about water usage. I'm a trout fisherman, so believe me, I'm concerned with having enough water in the streams in the summer so that they'll be cold enough to provide habitat for trout. But 1 million BTUs of ethanol takes 2,500 times more water than 1 million BTUs from fracked natural gas. Is that a surprise? It was to me. So if we're so concerned about water, what should we be doing with ethanol? We should be saying, my God, we can't do this. And yet you don't hear a peep about the water use that's required for ethanol. It's no different for other things. Coal is about 6 times as much. Oil is 4 to 6 times as much. Natural gas, in terms of water usage with fracking, is, I hate to say it this way, but it's a bargain. But nobody's been telling us that. Drilling fluid constituents. You know, all that bad stuff. Well, let's look at the bad stuff. 99.3% of water, of drilling fluids are water and sand. 99.3. So, if I had 100 marbles in a jar, 99 of them plus 3/10 of one of them would be a white marble, and 7/10 of one of them would be a red marble. Does that help put in perspective what we're talking about with volumes? 99.3 sand and water, 0.7 other constituents. What are those other constituents? Well, they consist of lubricity agent. Ooh, that's got to be bad. A lubricity agent. Well, the most common lubricity agent is mineral oil. And the next time you think about what you concoct for yourself to make suntan lotion, it's probably mineral oil and iodine. So I don't get too excited about the mineral oil part. Some of it is fungicide. Fungicide, that can be bad. But we're talking about 0.1%, and it's kind of like what farmers use and what people use on their lawn and what we use on golf courses. Yeah, there's risk, but there's risk every time we get in our car. And we calculate that risk and we close the door and turn the key. If we put salt on our food, is there risk? Yeah. In fact, if you put too much salt on your food, it can kill you right then and there. But we put salt on our food. We weigh the risk and we make a decision we're comfortable with. Bactericides. How many of you use Neosporin? Anybody ever use that? And that's a bactericide. And then there's a bad actor in there sometimes, hydrochloric acid. And the thing with hydrochloric acid is it gets in the formation, and depending on what's there, if there's any carbonate, what's the hydrochloric acid do? It fizzes and neutralizes itself, or when it comes back out, it gets treated and neutralized. I'm not making light, I'm just trying to explain what's really involved in the various constituents. Now, I hate to say this, but I'd like you to take what I just said and contrast it with what each of us dumps down our sink or flushes down our toilet. How many of you have any cleaning agents at home? What do you do with them? What do you do with them in the spring when you go out in your garage and you find, 10 containers that you pretty much figure you opened them last year, they're probably expired now, so what do we do with them? They go in the trash, or they go to the landfill on hazardous waste day and probably end up in a landfill. We shouldn't do that. And the companies shouldn't do things, and they're trying hard not to, just like we are. You just have to put these things in perspective when we point fingers. Believe me, I'm not advocating for dumping things down the sink or down the toilet. But it happens. It shouldn't. Now, you've heard me long enough. I have what I consider to be a privilege, and that is to introduce our next speaker. Greg Solis. Greg worked for me while I was DEC Commissioner. He was Director of the Minerals Division within DEC. He's now retired and is working as a consultant. But it was under Greg's leadership that we got the laws passed that are in place with regard to how do we drill for oil or gas in New York State. And he's going to mention some numbers that indicate that what he did has been very successful in terms of doing two things, and it's consistent again with New York's mission. He's been successful in terms of protecting the quality of New York's environment, and those regulations have been successful in terms of enabling the industry to drill. So both goals were met. And we owe him a debt of thanks. I think there's a good lesson here. Sometimes when DEC asks us to do things, we say, are they out of their blankety-blank mind? And maybe sometimes they are. But the important thing is that when it's done right, it can come back and actually work in your favor. And I think this is a good example of where it was done right. And now you'll have some information when you leave here today that will enable you to tell folks when they say, oh, we've had this number of water contamination cases and this and that. You may say, well, wait a minute. I heard a DEC speaker today, and that's just not the case. So with that, Greg?
Thank you for that introduction. I couldn't have written it better myself. I'm just going to jump right in here, hopefully. There we go. I'm going to be a little schizophrenic as I go through this. You'll see that when I talk about my old job being at DEC. So a lot of times I'll use the word we. But basically what I'm going to talk about today is the state's legislative history, the environmental concerns and mitigations, the GEIS, Generic Environmental Impact Statement, and the supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement process. The supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement highlights and some of the concerns that are still there, and then some of the next steps and timelines. For those of you who don't know it, we have New York has a tremendous history in oil and gas. We've had oil and gas wells drilled since the 1860s, primarily in Western New York, and therein lies part of the problem, because it's kind of a way of life in Western New York. We've drilled 75,000 wells in this state. See the wheat? You notice that? The wheat comes right back out. But we've drilled 75,000 wells in New York State, and you can see the old oil fields of the green areas. We were one of the major producers in the country at one time of oil, along with Pennsylvania. So part of the problem has been that as we talked about the Marcellus and we came east, the people in the Hudson Valley, the people in, obviously, Oneida, this part of the state, really knows nothing about how the oil and gas industry operates, and more importantly, how DEC regulates the oil and gas industry. So, you've seen, I keep going to the thing here instead of this one. Okay. I knew it was too good to be true.
It's got to be pointed right at it.
Right at the down.
I'll just advance it for you. I'll do one.
Well, we're talking about the Marcellus here. And the Marcellus may be the #1 or #2 largest natural gas deposit in the world. So this isn't about a landowner and a greedy oil company or gas company that wants to produce oil and gas. This is about the future of the state of New York. And don't misunderstand that, because this is a very, very big deal. This is an international game changer. We're talking about it. As a nation, we consume about 23 or 24 trillion cubic feet of gas a year. This 500 trillion cubic feet is just enormous, and it may be even bigger than that. As Mike talked about, there's been technological advances to be able to produce the gas from these tight shales, coupled with horizontal drilling. It's near population centers and markets. It's in depressed areas of the state, both in Pennsylvania and New York, and it is an international game changer. And to answer the question over here about demand, as we as a nation have a supply of natural gas, a long-term supply of natural gas, you will see no new demand. You will see new changes in terms of transportation. Excuse me. New England is something like 60 to 80% imported oil for the residential heat. So there are no pipelines in northern New England, for example. And there will be great demand. And by the way, farmers who dry their corn with LPG or something else could be able to convert to natural gas. There will be a tremendous savings in that as well. So, this is the Marcellus. It goes from Ohio and New York all the way down to West Virginia. And you'll see the Utica there as well. And in our state, here's the Marcellus. This comes out of the SGIS, the Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement. You see the fairway here. This is the area, this just checked area, but this cross-hatched area. That's where they believe the potential is greatest. And then behind that, we have the Utica, which is probably, which we really haven't talked about because we haven't explored the Utica at all. But that could be at least as or even more prolific and in your area. That's really probably the target area as well. Now, I tried to put together a slide which talked about the relative investment in New York versus the relative investment in Pennsylvania and the timelines and so, and it got so complicated that I just went by it. Let's go back to that. Next page.
There we go.
This is not far from the truth. This is exactly where we are, and it still amazes me to this day that we are so far behind. So why are we far behind? What is the difference between Pennsylvania and New York? Well, we have a different framework, regulatory framework under SECR, which is the State Environmental Quality Review Act. We want everything in place before we proceed, versus Pennsylvania, who let everything go ahead and then corrected things as they went along. We have a very formidable array of conflicting groups and ideas and geographic differences. Certainly the people in the Mid-Hudson and New York City want to tell us, upstaters, what our land should look like, what our landscape should look like. The media is not informed. I had irresponsible, but I changed it to responsible, not responsible. Anybody here like horse racing? Okay, I love horse racing. Okay, and the New York Times did an expose last year. Last week that was just incredibly inaccurate about horse racing. So. They're not just inaccurate about natural gas, I guess. They're inaccurate about everything. And it was really disgraceful that they would compare the regulatory environment in Mexico, in New Mexico for quarter horse racing versus the regulatory systems that we have in New York. But anyway, so the papers. So we've been fighting all these things. Well, let's go talk about the law. The oil, gas, and solution mining law really comes out of, we've been a member of the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, which is a group of producing states around the country. There's about 32 states, 32 producing states, and there are some international affiliates like Canada and other places like that, Venezuela. But our law is based on Texas and Oklahoma law. And it's called the Modified Law of Capture, which is a little bit different than the law in Pennsylvania, which is the law of capture, which means that you can go and drill a well and drain your neighbor's property. We don't have that in New York. We have a modified law of capture, and we have spacing laws. In other words, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And we have correlative rights, which means that you cannot take the gas from your neighbor's property. You have to be compensated for the gas that comes from your property. And we have sophisticated compulsory integration and unitization rules, which just means that some small landowner can't hold up all the other landowners, and there's a process to go through that. It's a complicated process, but all of this came about, the Texas and Oklahoma law came about in around 1900 when they found gas, they found oil in Spindletop, Texas, and basically what happened is they drilled a well, a guy came along, drilled a well right next door, a guy came along, and what you had is this is an actual photo. So they were creating, there are two terms that you'll find within the ECL, within the Environmental Conservation Law, conservation and waste. And those two terms really go to spacing wells. In 1981, we really modernized the statute. There were a number of changes that were made to the statute. And it was developed as a groundwater protection program. That's basically what the program does. And there were a whole bunch of provisions facing correlative rights, fees for new staff, and supersedure of local regulation, which I'll talk briefly about, but we're going to have another speaker who's going to talk about that anyway. The supersedure provision was tightly drawn to say that the state reserves all the rights to the state, that the state shall supersede all local laws and regulations, with the exception of roads and taxes. And there was a companion tax bill that passed at that time. And zoning was included in this provision, according to me. And you'll see that in the affidavits because I'm the expert witness in both of those cases. And it was tightly drawn because of problems that were occurring with local governments. Quite significant safety problems because, actually they came about because the state had no staff to go out there and regulate. So the new law then was to give the state, was to impose fees upon the industry so that they would pay for the regulation. If there's anything you leave with today, this is the thing I want you to understand. In the 1980s, we sat down with the industry and we said, you tell us how to protect the fresh water of the state of New York and the drilling of these wells. And what we did is, and there was some hair pulling, you can tell, but there was some hair pulling at the time. But basically what we have is a redundant set of conditions to protect the fresh water of the state. 2 strings of pipe, 2 sheets of cement between any well that's drilled in the state of New York. And these conditions have been relatively unchanged for almost 30 years. These conditions were just adopted by Pennsylvania in December of 2010. So it's no wonder that they've had problems in gas migration and in bad cement jobs. We have never had that problem. And we really have had no well that's impacted the ground of the state since at least the 1980s. And this is yes?
Did you mention how many wells have been drilled and there has been no impact?
It's right here. 10,000 wells have been drilled since 1980 with no problems. Literally no problems. There was one, you just saw the asterisk in the last slide. There was one problem for 36 hours which we rectified. But, and here's what we're talking about. Here we're talking about the aquifer at 500 feet and the formation, let's say, at 5,000 feet. This is a vertical well, obviously. But the same thing as Mike was talking about would be horizontal, would be this way. And what we have here is water, cement, pipe, cement, pipe, wellbore. 2 strings of pipe, 2 sheets of cement on every single well drilled in the state since the 1980s. And we had aquifer conditions as well. 3 strings of pipe and 3 sheets of cement. And we've drilled hundreds of wells in the Jamestown aquifer, for example, since really around the turn of the century. And we also had a provision that the DEC person, the inspector, had to be on site to witness the cement coming back to the surface. In other words, you couldn't drill an aquifer well unless we were on site when they did the cement job, so that we ensured that the fresh water was protected. And there had been, as far as I know, only one lawsuit on a well-drilled, a state lawsuit at least, on any well that was drilled. That was by the city of Jamestown, who questioned our aquifer conditions, and their own consultant found that we had at least as stringent, or probably the most stringent, conditions in the entire nation. The State Environmental Quality Review Act came about in 1970, and this is a way in which the department, and actually the state, reviews projects. And for the purposes of drilling an oil and gas well, we thought the best way to approach this was to review things on a generic basis. So that's what we did. We did a generic environmental impact statement. We started in 1988, and we finished in 1992. So that now you didn't have to do an environmental impact statement every time you came in the door for a permit. You could review the permit. It was consistent with the conditions. If you had the casing and cementing conditions that we talked about, if you had anything else, you would get your permit. You would go ahead and drill the well. So what happened is in 2008, when the governor Patterson signed legislation, he said, well, you didn't really review in 1992, you didn't really review horizontal wells, and you really didn't review these high-volume hydrofracking wells. We only reviewed wells that were used 80,000 gallons of water, now you're going to use millions of gallons of water. So he said you've got to do a supplemental generic environmental impact statement to supplement the information back to 92. And this is the correct approach. Unfortunately, it's taken 4 years. But really what has changed, well, the scope of operations has changed. There's no question about it that it is an industrial site. There's going to be a lot of water. There's going to be a lot of trucks. These things were not evaluated. The time period to drill the well, there's going to be multiple wells drilled from a pad, so you're going to have intermittent. You might have two months worth of activity, and then a year later you might have another 2 months worth of activity, and a year later you might have another 2 months worth of activity, and we can talk a little bit about that. But all these issues are being addressed, or have been addressed in the SGIS. What it is not is an evaluation of hydraulic fracturing. We've been doing hydraulic fracturing in this country since 1900. This is not new. The technique is exactly the same that they've been doing since in our state since the 60s in the Medina sandstone. What is new is horizontally. They're doing it horizontally, and they're doing it with much more water. That's new. But the technique itself, horizontal hydrofracking, is not the review. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of confusion on this part. The Barnett wells in Texas, North Texas, drilled maybe 13, maybe even 14,000 wells by now. They've all been fracked. So hydrofracking is not new. The SGIS is not about hydrofracking. And we've drilled over 1 million wells in the country. I was the governor's representative to the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission for 20 years. Nobody ever raised the issue that hydrofracking in and by itself can cause any contamination in groundwater. And if you think about it, if you talk about that horizontal line, there's no way that fluids are going to go in this direction. The only place that they can impact the groundwater is through the casing and cementing program. This is against gravity. You're not going to go from 5,000 to 500 feet. This is against gravity and against what's called
Darcy's Law.
Darcy's Law, thank you. Darcy's Law, which basically says, okay, you drill a hole here, the idea is to crack the formation and get the gas to flow back into the hole. Everything is going to flow back into that hole, if you think about it. And of course, you also have all kinds of layers of cap rock over that anyway. So it is, I hate to say it's impossible. I told the legislators this, it's impossible. That's a bad thing to tell a legislator. But I did, and I argued with them. I said, it's impossible, you know, but it could happen, I guess, but it's virtually impossible based on the laws of physics and based on gravity. So, and DEC has said there's never been any record of a contamination from a hydrofrac well. If you look at one of the appendices, I think it's 15, you'll see a number of letters from other state agencies that say the same thing. It's not a problem. Now, spacing, no, I want to go back. Spacing, I told you I talked a bit about this. Spacing is just the amount of acreage to conserve. Remember I talked about the two words, conserve and waste. So you want to be able to drill a well and recover as much gas as you can from that spacing of that well. In the Marcellus, the spacing of a vertical well is 40 acres. Okay? So you cannot drain your neighbor's property, as I said, for the paroleal rights. The drilling plan can't leave out properties, in other words, leave stranded acreage. And most importantly, it doesn't respect municipal boundaries. And that's part and parcel of why the supersedure provisions, you know, it's my contention that the supersedure provisions, we never even discussed zoning because we reserved it all for the state. And in 2005 and 2008, remember I talked about the governor signing legislation, the state did a good thing. I had nothing to do with this, but the state and the industry worked out the spacing for both vertical and horizontal wells for the Marcellus. And one of the big secrets is, as Mike started to say, that there's very little impact. You can drain a 640-acre unit with a 5-acre pad on one side of the property. It's landowner friendly, it's farm friendly. This makes all the sense in the world. So the old way we would have drilled in a 640-acre, if we drilled the 40 acres, we would drill 16 wells. Each of those wells would take maybe 2 acres of a pad. You're affecting 32 acres. This way you're affecting 5 acres. And you're draining the same property. So it's much more efficient, it's much more landowner friendly, and because it is a blanket formation, you can literally put the pad at one end of the property so that you can farm your fields without any problem. And the DEC, and part of this legislation also said that 640 acres is the maximum. That may change because what they found in Pennsylvania is if you put two 640s back to back, you can drill in this direction and drain it. You can drill in this direction. So you're now draining 1,280 acres with a 5-acre pad. Think about that. Tremendous. You know, this is high tech. This is not the Beverly Hillbillies. These wells cost upwards of $5 million plus a lot more. So it's not the old boys. So in September of 2000, you know, we're going to skip through a lot of the early stuff, but in September 2011, DEC came out with the generic environmental impact statement, and there are a number of new problems. And I don't want anybody to think that everything is hunky-dory, because basically what they said is, you can't put a well in an aquifer, you can't put it in the New York City watershed, you can't put it in Skinny Atlas, you can't put it in a 100-year floodplain. They put in a whole bunch of things that caused problems. And by the way, we're the only place you can't drill a well in an aquifer in the country is in New York. Does that make any sense to anybody? You know, after I told you that we drilled hundreds of wells in the Jamestown aquifer since 1900s, we've got this. So there are problems, and when they released the SGIS on Friday, they said, well, 85% of the land is still available to be drilled. And I said, that can't be, as a regulator, I knew that could not be right. There's no question that wasn't right. And then on Monday morning, they said, well, it's really 80%, it's not 85%. And I knew that was way off. And basically what we found out is, I skipped one. Yeah, there you go. What we found out is that some companies went back and looked at their acres, it's really like 40 or 50%. So what DEC has done is devalued your property by 50%, by taking 50% of it off the table. Hopefully they'll come to their senses and change some things. But what they've really done here is they've said, if you start to think about how you're going to set out your units and drill your wells, what they've done is they've created more environmental impact because you're probably going to have to drill more wells to drain that 640 acres. So they've done the reverse, basically. They've created more impact by, they've basically removed the drilling efficiencies that I talked about by leaving this system in place. And hopefully these things will change. There's a lot of regulatory uncertainty. You can't tell how long it's going to take to get a permit. You can't really get through the process. There are multiple points of approval within DEC and external DEC with DOH, Department of Health, and Transportation.
Rick,
Yes.
I know you're being politically correct, but when you talk about an external point of approval, what you're really talking about is politics.
Well, it isn't necessarily politics, but if a DOT guy is going to give no urgency to a piece of work that needs to be done for another agency. It just isn't. You know that to get them to do anything for another agency is, it just doesn't happen. So having external approval, and by the way, that also includes the local governments too, because the local governments, well, if you don't want to drill 2 wells consecutively